The purest wild animals in American history are hiding a 120-year-old secret in their blood. In the spring of 2022, a massive genetic study proved that every single bison alive today, even the fiercely guarded, untouchable Yellowstone herd, has domestic cattle DNA hardwired into its genome. We are going to break down exactly how the desperate rescue of a dying species accidentally contaminated it, and why this supposed failure is actually the greatest survival story ever told. If you want to understand the hidden mechanics of how history actually happens, stories that build this kind of deep curiosity, that is exactly what we do exclusively here on the WildRevival channel. Hit subscribe because we move fast. Let us go. In 2022, geneticist James Durr and his team at Texas A&M University decided to run a massive test that the rest of the scientific field thought was completely unnecessary. They sequenced the full genomes of bison from every major historical lineage across the continent, and then they lined those sequences up against the genomes of 1,842 domestic cattle. They were hunting for microscopic fragments of DNA that just did not belong. They fully expected to find the genetic fingerprints of cattle in private, commercial herds. And they did. But what nobody saw coming was where else those fragments surfaced. The genetic signature of domestic cattle lit up in every single bison genome they analyzed. Every single one, including the animals roaming Yellowstone National Park. For over a century, the Yellowstone herd had been fiercely guarded and fenced off from the outside world. They were widely celebrated as the absolute gold standard of conservation. They were considered the last perfectly pure wild bison left on planet Earth. But the data did not lie. The purest animals alive are carrying a 120-year-old genetic glitch. If that completely shatters what you thought you knew about Yellowstone, hit the like button right now because the real mystery is how it got there. But to understand how the ultimate conservation victory was actually built on a permanent genetic compromise, you have to look at the 23 animals that broke the math of extinction. Great Plains, 1873. A single herd of bison stretches farther than the human eye can follow. A dark river of animals moving across grassland that runs unbroken to the horizon. Somewhere between 30 and 60 million of them once covered North America. They shaped the prairie itself. Their hooves broke and turned the soil. Their grazing decided which plants lived and which died. And entire nations of people built their economies, their food, and their faith around the herds. Then, in the span of a single human lifetime, they were almost erased. Not slowly, not by accident. The destruction of the American bison was one of the fastest collapses of a large animal anywhere in recorded history. Commercial outfits stripped hides by the millions and shipped them east by the rail car. Passengers fired rifles from open train windows for sport and left the bodies to rot where they fell. Military leaders understood that wiping out the herds meant breaking the plains tribes who depended on them, and they let the slaughter run entirely unchecked. By the late 1880s, the arithmetic had turned almost unbelievable. From tens of millions down to a few hundred. One careful survey put the number of wild bison left alive in the United States at exactly 541. That is it. 541 animals to carry a species that had once darkened the horizon from Texas to Canada. Have you ever seen a piece of history or nature disappear that fast in your own lifetime? Let me know in the comments below, because a collapse of this scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Scientists today describe this moment as a genetic bottleneck. 7% reduction that brought the species within a hair of outright extinction. The entire genetic raw material of tens of millions of animals was suddenly squeezed down into a few hundred terrified survivors. Whatever those survivors happened to carry in their blood, the future would inherit. And the most isolated survivors of all were hiding high in the mountains of Yellowstone. By 1902, even the hidden valleys of Yellowstone were not safe. Poachers slipped into the park's backcountry and shot the last wild bison for their heads, which sold to private collectors for more than most working men earned in a year. When rangers finally took a hard count of what remained in the central valleys, they reached a number that stopped them cold. 23. That was the number. Just 23 exhausted animals standing together in a single fenced pasture. The men running the park understood the danger at once. Extinction was not a risk anymore, it was a mathematical certainty. A herd that small does not only risk being shot out of existence. It risks collapsing from the inside as inbreeding hollows out the bloodline one generation at a time, weakening calves until the line simply ends. They needed fresh animals, and they needed them immediately. They would rebuild the Yellowstone herd by bringing in bison from outside the park. There was just one massive obstacle. Almost nowhere else on the continent had any bison left to give. Instead of a massive government initiative, the rescue came from the fringes. A handful of rogue private citizens, native and frontier families, had been quietly saving the species while the official world looked the other way. Here is the part of the rescue that rarely makes it into the textbooks. Back in 1873, a Pend Oreille man remembered today as walking coyote crossed the Continental Divide with a small group of orphan bison calves. Their mothers had been killed in a hunt on the plains. With nowhere else to go, the calves had followed the hunter's horses for safety. He brought somewhere between 4 and 7 of them home to the Flathead Valley. By 1884, that handful had grown into a herd of around 13. He sold those animals to 2 ranchers of mixed native and European heritage, Michel Pablo and Charles Allard, who turned them loose to range across the grasslands of the Flathead Reservation. The herd kept growing. In 1893, the 2 men expanded it further, buying dozens more bison from a famous frontier rancher named Buffalo Jones. Far to the south, in the Texas Panhandle, a rancher named Charles Goodnight had built his own herd from a few survivors his wife had urged him to protect. Between them, these private citizens were holding a meaningful share of the entire species in their pastures. If you love the fact that a few stubborn underdog citizens saved the species while the government slept, hit that like button right now to validate the real heroes of this story. These were the people Yellowstone turned to. In 1902, the park bought 21 bison from these private owners. 18 of them were females from the Pablo Allard herd in Montana. 3 were bulls from the Goodnight herd in Texas. The animals were shipped in by rail and raised at a working ranch inside the park in a wide sweep of grassland called the Lamar Valley. The plan was simple and on its own terms absolutely brilliant. Let those 21 fresh outsiders breed with the 23 exhausted indigenous survivors. Fold the 2 groups together and grow a single wild herd from the combined bloodlines. It is the reason there are bison in Yellowstone today. And for a while, everything about the plan looked like pure, flawless success. The combined herd took hold and began to grow across the Lamar Valley, and the crisis seemed to pass. But that calm is exactly what hid the problem. To understand what was riding inside those Montana and Texas animals, you have to know what ranchers across the West had been doing in the years before Yellowstone ever called. During the massive beef shortages that followed the Great Slaughter, breeders got desperate. They decided to try something that looked clever on a ledger. They deliberately crossed domestic cattle with bison, hoping to engineer a hardier, beefier superanimal that carried more meat. They even coined a name for the result. They called it the Catalo. The experiment was a total failure. The hybrids never grew the way the ranchers wanted, and most of them abandoned the idea. But here is the thing about history. Sometimes the mistakes outlive the intention. If you want more stories where a forgotten historical footnote completely rewrites the science we thought we knew, hit subscribe right now. This type of deep dive storytelling is exclusively only on the WildRevival channel. The experiment failed. They abandoned the breeding program. But abandoning the program did not undo the breeding. Some of those crossbred animals and their descendants stayed quietly hidden inside those private herds. The exact same private herds that Yellowstone bought from in 1902 to rebuild the entire species. They could not undo the genetics. And for 120 years, absolutely nobody noticed. And it nearly took an even stranger turn. By the early 1900s, Michel Pablo's herd had outgrown the open range, and he offered to sell hundreds of his bison back to the United States government. He asked $250 a head. Washington sent an inspector, looked over one of the largest bison herds on Earth, and offered him $25 a head. After negotiation, the figure crept up to $75. Insulted, Pablo walked away from the United States entirely and sold his herd to the government of Canada instead. Starting in 1907, more than 700 of his animals were captured, loaded onto trains at Ravalli, Montana, and shipped over 1,000 miles north to preserves in Alberta. It was either an act of remarkable nerve or a catastrophic blunder by the United States. Either way, the seed stock of the species was now scattered across 2 countries. All of it descended from the same small, mixed founder herds. What those founders started did not stay small. By the middle of the 20th century, the rebuilt herds had climbed back into the thousands. At the National Bison Range in Montana, a white buffalo named Big Medicine, born in 1933, became a living emblem of that recovery. His pale coat made him almost unique, and tribal members traveled to see him and to pray in his presence. When he died in 1959, the animal that had once stood at the very edge of oblivion had become something close to sacred again. The species had been hauled back from nothing. What almost nobody understood yet was what exactly had been hauled back. By 2022, the Yellowstone bison had become a conservation triumph measured in clean, round numbers. For decades, researchers believed those animals carried 2 distinct ancestral lines running side by side. One traced back to the 23 indigenous survivors. The other traced back to the bison hauled up from northern Montana. Geneticists even had names for them, 2 separate clades preserved in the maternal DNA. Yellowstone was treated as the ultimate gold standard because everyone agreed it was the last truly pure bison genome left on Earth. That assumption is exactly what James Durr and his team set out to confirm. When doctoral student Sam Stroop and collaborator Brian Davis looked at the data, the impossible math became a documented reality. The cattle signature lit up everywhere. Every single bison genome the team analyzed carried identifiable regions of cattle DNA. The private commercial herds, yes, but also the national park herds. As Stroop pointed out, the cattle signature even turned up in herds that earlier genetic studies had specifically cleared, including Yellowstone and Elk Island in Canada. Both were long believed to be entirely free of cattle ancestry. 24% cattle ancestry. 8%. That number sounds tiny. It is tiny. Low enough that, for 100 years, the signal had hidden safely beneath the resolution of every test anyone could run. But it was real, and it had been there the whole time. And here is the absolute best way to put that percentage into perspective. If you are of European or Asian descent, you carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA in your own genome. In the strictest genetic sense, the purest wild bison alive today is actually less mixed than you are. If that comparison just blew your mind, hit the like button right now to lock in that exact moment of realization. When this data dropped, the reaction inside the industry was not quiet. Managers of large private herds were thrown into complete turmoil. Conservationists panicked. The clean, pure record of Yellowstone was officially ruined. But the scientists looking at the data realized something else. Something that flips this entire story completely upside down. Purity is a human idea. Geneticist Oliver Ryder cautioned the entire industry against judging these animals by purity at all. Why? Because the prairie simply does not deal in clean lines. Brian Davis backed this up with a massive scientific reality check. Hybridization, the blending of lineages, is not some modern accident to be ashamed of. It is a normal, working engine of evolution woven through the history of countless species. Contamination, survival, they were the exact same event. The people who dragged the bison back from extinction with one hand quietly rewired its genetic future with the other. If those rogue ranchers had never experimented, if they had never touched a domestic cow, the bison would not be impure today. They would be gone entirely. Does knowing this change how you look at conservation? Would you rather have a 99% pure species survive, or lose them completely to keep nature perfect? Let me know your take in the comments below. If stories that completely reframe the way you see the natural world are exactly what you are looking for, this type of story is exclusively only on the WildRevival channel. Hit subscribe right now and join the community. And once you accept that the walls of purity are an illusion, you do not need to keep the herds locked up anymore. You just need space. And that is exactly what happened next. Because the illusion of purity is gone, the real work can finally move at lightning speed. You can already see the shift on the ground. Across the country, bison are returning to native lands at a scale not witnessed in over a century. In 2024, federal and Montana officials agreed to shorten the quarantine period for bull bison leaving Yellowstone from about a year and a half down to roughly 300 days. Instead of sending excess animals to slaughter, they redirect them straight to tribal nations. Yellowstone rewrites its own century-old playbook. They rip up the suffocating political cap of 3,000 animals. They let the herd surge, targeting a massive new range pushing 6,000. Then the floodgates open entirely. Early 2026. The largest single bison transfer ever recorded ships 213 animals directly to the Fort Peck Reservation. The Assiniboine and Sioux tribes instantly take management of hundreds of buffalo across tens of thousands of acres of restored grassland. One tribal leader described the buffalo's return as a journey of healing for the land and for the people. That phrase is not decoration. For the tribes of the Great Plains, the buffalo had always been far more than an animal. It was food and shelter and tool and ceremony at once, the center of a way of life the slaughter had been built to destroy. Bringing the herds home is for many nations the same act as bringing back a piece of themselves. The Intertribal Buffalo Council now coordinates that work across dozens of member tribes, treating every transfer as restoration in far more than the ecological sense. The scale of that comeback is hard to overstate. Since 2020, conservation partnerships have hauled more than 2,300 buffalo back to native lands across the country. A single organization, American Prairie, has relocated over 500 bison to tribes and conservation herds, while assembling a massive, unbroken reserve of well over 100,000 acres of Montana grassland. If seeing the underdog actually win and take back 100,000 acres of land makes you smile, hit the like button right now to validate this massive comeback. Inside Yellowstone, the final piece of the puzzle clicks into place. The two ancestral lines that scientists tracked as separated groups for over a century, the indigenous survivors and the Montana newcomers, have quietly merged. Kept distinct in the record books for 120 years, they no longer exist as separate clades on a spreadsheet. They now move and breed across the park as one single, unified powerhouse of a herd. What do you think is the most impressive part of this recovery? Is it the science, the tribes taking back the land, or the absolute survival of the animals themselves? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want to keep tracking these massive, high-stakes environmental comebacks, this type of fast-paced, behind-the-scenes storytelling is exclusively only on the WildRevival channel. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. A population once small enough to count on two hands is now an empire thousands strong. Which leaves us with one unavoidable truth. 23 survivors. 21 outsiders. One single, unified genome that still remembers all of it. The purest wild bison on Earth. 7% untouched. That claim was perfectly true and fundamentally false at the exact same time. And the narrow gap between the two holds the entire history of the species. The trace of cattle DNA inside a Yellowstone bison reads less like a stain on the story and more like the fingerprint of the rescue itself. A handful of stubborn, unrecognized people dragged an entire species back from the edge of absolutely nothing. And the saving left a mark that never washed out. If this incredible underdog survival story was worth your time, hit that like button to send this video to more people. What historical mystery or wild comeback story should we investigate next? Drop your answer in the comments below. If you want more stories where the science quietly overturns everything we thought we knew, this type of high-stakes historical storytelling is exclusively only on the WildRevival channel. Hit subscribe. We will see you in the next one.